Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm extremely grateful to the OIE Secretariat, but also to the members for the invitation. It's a very important opportunity to present the work that we've been doing at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, on good regulatory practices, but also the synergies that we are developing with the OIE in this area. So, indeed, I'm Céline Kauffmann from the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD, and the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD is the part of the OECD that deals with good regulatory practices, that develops the analytical work, but also monitors and tracks countries' implementation of good regulatory practices. Unlike the OIE, the OECD is an intergovernmental organization, so we respond to government delegates. And in that area of regulatory policy, our delegates come from the centers of government. They are, if you will, the regulatory oversight bodies. They are the regulators of regulators, those that are responsible for developing and applying the disciplines of regulatory policy across government. And to give you a couple of examples, in France, for example, they would come from the Secrétariat Général du Gouvernement. In the US, they would come from OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, in the Office of Management and Budget of the White House. In Australia, they would be with the Prime Minister Office. In Germany and Austria, for instance, they would come from the Chancellery. So they're not the line ministries. They are the ones that are at the center of government, providing to the line ministries some of these key principles that we heard before of transparency, evidence-based policymaking, in particular applied to technical regulations and legislation originating from the executive. Given the importance of good regulatory practices that was reminded to us yesterday by Dr. Sarah Khan, I was actually asked by the OIE to present to you the understanding of good regulatory practices developed at the OECD, both at the domestic level, but also increasingly at the international level. So this is what I'm going to do in a few slides now. The OECD has been working on good regulatory practices, in particular at the domestic level, for the past 30 years, more or less, and that expertise, in a way, crystallized or was synthesized in 2012 in a normative instrument of the OECD, the soft law of the OECD, which is a recommendation of the Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance that you see on the screen. There are 12 principles that embody these good regulatory practices. I'm not going to go through all of these principles. What I'll do is to highlight a couple of them that resonate well with the discussions you're having today, but also yesterday. The first one is embodied in Principle 2, and is about the transparency we've been discussing this morning, and the importance of involving stakeholders in rulemaking, and of involving those that are affected and can usefully inform the rulemaking process. So that's Principle 2 of that recommendation. But you also have other principles, in particular Principle 4 and 5 that you see on the screen, that are about the importance of evidence-based rules, technical regulations, legislations, meaning rules that aim to address a specific issue and that are developed to address a problem, and that are regularly evaluated for their impacts, starting ex ante through, for example, regulatory impact assessments, and exposed to ensure that they achieve their objectives and they can be amended, revised regularly to keep up with the fast development of technologies and so on. Then you'll see a principle, which is Principle 9, which is highlighting the importance of risk-based regulation that was mentioned yesterday as well. And the last principle that is highlighted on the slide I want to spend a bit of time on is the importance for domestic regulators to consider the international environment when regulating. And that principle has two main components. The first one is the importance for regulators to consider the impacts of any regulatory measure on international flows, including trade. And the second one, which is related with that, is the importance of considering international standards and other relevant regulatory frameworks when developing and revising regulations, which is very much in line with what we heard previously from the WTO, SPS, and TBT requirements. So if you look at that last principle, you'll see that, you will notice that this consideration for the international environment has been made a key principle and a key part of regulatory quality for domestic regulators by the OECD. And this is the aspect that I will focus on in the next slides. Well, we're talking about the potential cost for traders and the potential impacts of diverging standards, diverging regulations, but what does it mean very concretely? We've started at the OECD with our trade colleagues to look more in details into what the cost of regulatory divergences across jurisdictions, and in particular the cost for traders. It is fair to say that we haven't found a lot of evidence, and we are only starting building the evidence base on these impacts of regulatory divergences. And what we did to start that collection of evidence, you know, the OECD is famous for its database, data collection, and so on, but we always start by developing the analytical framework to frame that data collection. So we started by trying to understand, for a specific trader, what are the costs that he may face because of divergences in regulation, divergences in testing, inspection methods, and so on. And basically, we identified three behind-the-border costs for traders. So we exclude the at the borders that may be costs that may be substantial as well. And you see on that slide the three costs that any trader business may face by trading across different jurisdictions. One has to do with the information cost of obtaining and processing information on different regulatory requirements across jurisdictions. One has to do with the cost of specifying products to these different regulatory requirements. And the last one has to do with the cost of showing conformity with these regulatory requirements across different jurisdictions. So showing actually the conformity documents that you're meeting those regulatory requirements across jurisdiction. We are looking at mapping these costs across different sectors just now. Obviously, those costs will be very sector-specific, and they will be also, when international standards are not adopted, very specific to the pair of countries that you're considering. But two key facts that we've seen through looking at the evidence is that first, those costs will be disproportionately affecting global value chain, because when you have a product crossing borders many times, that product will face the subsequent cost of crossing these different borders and the different regulatory requirements. That's the first evidence that we can see from that work. The second one is that in terms of the business that is affected, the SMEs will be disproportionately affected by those costs compared to a big company that actually has the knowledge of different regulatory requirements. In particular, the information cost is a very big cost of entry for SMEs wishing to trade across borders. So what can countries do to actually reduce those costs of regulatory divergences across countries? The work, our work shows that there's actually different ways that regulators can cooperate across borders to help reduce those costs, in particular to traders. And they vary, they can be bilateral, they can be regional, they can be multilateral cooperation mechanisms. They can be a strong legally binding approach, such as regulatory harmonization through common rules, typically in the EU, or they can be equivalence, mutual recognition approaches that do not necessarily require changes in regulation, and going through the adoption of standards, for example. I won't go further on that specific slide, just know that we've done work on understanding the benefits, the costs, the challenges of these different approaches to what we call regulatory cooperation at the OECD. If we focus now on the topic that is really of interest to the discussion today, which is how can the adoption of international standards drive regulatory convergence and reduce costs for traders, well, we've seen before, and it was discussed earlier today as well, the adoption of international standards can help reduce the trade cost when the different domestic jurisdictions actually adopt these international standards. So they actually support globalized production and markets. They can facilitate and reduce the cost across these global value chains that I mentioned earlier. But I think the key message from that slide is that the trade benefits are not the only ones of adopting international standards. There are other benefits that are often hidden or forgotten that are as important for regulators to keep in mind. One is that obviously international standards do not come out of thin air. They are the product of experts, regulators coming together and developing these standards and pooling their expertise and the state-of-art knowledge and evidence that they have on a specific topic. They're usually developed by international organizations such as the OIE or other IOs that are represented on the panel, WHO, FAO. And they can really bring to the less resourced and advanced jurisdictions the knowledge that has been developed in other jurisdictions and is embodied in a way in these standards. So that's a very strong point. And I think the FAO representative also reminded us that these standards can also help achieve policy objectives of regulators related to sustainable development, to fighting poverty as well. So it's not only a trade objective and impacts that you can actually collect through this adoption of international standards. Having said that, through the work that we've done, we can see some, let's say that the potential of international standards is not necessarily fully tapped at the domestic level. We see some reluctance in some domestic jurisdictions to adopt these international standards. Sometimes because of a lack of knowledge of applicable standards. So it's an issue of governments spreading the news or the information about the availability of these standards, of these applicable standards. But sometimes it's also the result of regulators not necessarily trusting that those international standards will help them fulfill their policy objectives. Regulators have a strong mandate of protecting welfare, and if they don't see that the international standards can help them achieve that, they will be reluctant. And this is where some of the discussions we had earlier is very appropriate as well on the need for transparency, not only at the domestic level, but also at the international level, on the need of applying good regulatory practices, not only at the domestic level, but also at the international level, to provide this confidence in the international standards that they can actually fulfill the mandate of regulators. And this is why a few years back, in 2014, based on that work that we were doing at the domestic level, we launched a voluntary platform of international organizations for them to work collectively, including with their membership, on what it takes to be a good international standard setters. What kind of good regulatory practices should be applied at the international level to ensure, like domestic regulators do at the domestic level, that the instruments that they develop at the international level are of good quality. The OIE was one of the first organizations to join the partnership and the voluntary platform and was convinced of the value of always promoting good standards. But today, there are 45 international organizations that actually contribute to this peer learning exercise, exchange information, practices on how to improve international standards. And I'll take a few minutes just to show you what are the focuses of that work that international organizations are doing together. There's also a platform of academics, some 20 academics that contribute their research to that work. The members of the OECD are also involved into those discussions. There is analytical work that is developed based on the exchange of information within the voluntary platform. So there are 5 specific focuses of exchange of practices and information across international organizations. The first one is about understanding the variety of international instruments that international organizations develop. We did a big survey to 50 international organizations back in 2015, and one of the key results was that there's a range of international instruments, normative in nature, that international organizations develop, from strong legally binding tools to voluntary tools, such as technical standards, for example. And within that category of soft instruments, there's a big variety, a big diversity of language use, sometimes for the same instruments and sometimes for different instruments. So one working group comprising these international organizations focuses very strongly on understanding the variety of international tools, international normative instruments, their benefits and challenges, and in particular in relation to their application in domestic jurisdiction. Then one of the key highlight or message coming out of the first phase of the work that we did with international organizations and that big survey that we carried out was that international organizations very often focus very highly on the development of standards, on exchange of information across jurisdictions, on potentially the highlight and development of best practice across jurisdictions and the development of normative tools. Very few of them focus on the downstream of the rulemaking cycle to ensure that the international standards, once developed, are actually applied in domestic jurisdictions. It's a common feature across international organizations. So based on that, a working group was built to understand how to foster implementation and to help implementation of international instruments. And needless to say that the observatory that the OIE is considering is one of these very forthcoming, forward-looking ideas building on some of the other practices of other international organizations that will contribute to understand better how to implement through monitoring more systematically and improving the quality of international instruments. There are 2 working groups focusing, one on how to improve the transparency and stakeholder engagement in international instruments. That one is actually led by WHO, which has developed a very ambitious framework for involving non-state actors in the development of their normative instruments. What you see on that graph is that actually, if there's a trend that has been prevalent over the course of the last 2 decades, has been the opening of the rulemaking processes of international organizations. More and more international organizations are trying to involve stakeholders into the development of standards and are being transparent. There's much more they can do, but it's a key feature of the past and trend of the past years. By comparison, what you see on that slide is that international organizations are much less advanced in terms of developing the evaluation of the impacts of their tools, of their normative instruments, which in a way is related to the weaknesses in implementation, but is also related to the lack of information on what's happening at the domestic level with those international instruments. And the bad aspect to that is that if you don't know how your international instruments fare once on the ground, it's very difficult to keep up with the technological development and also all the changes that may require changes in your international instruments. The last focus, and I'll stop here, is about coordination across international organizations. It was identified as a key topic for discussion across international organizations. Sometimes domestic regulators are faced with a lot of international standards to the extent that they're a bit confused about which one to adopt. But beyond that, cooperation across international organizations, and we heard that before, is a critical factor to ensure the implementation and capacity building on international instruments. So that working group in particular focuses on the interesting coordination practices and the successful ones. We heard about the Codex being a joint institution between WHO and FAO, for example. That would be an example of coordination. Well, I'll stop here. I realize that it's not easy to synthesize that work in 10 minutes, and I'll be very happy. I hope that he will give you the appetite to look into what we've been doing in these areas, and I'll be very happy to answer any question.